Okay, so good evening, Dr. Jaccard. It's extremely nice to connect with you, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us. So do you mind if we record the interview so that we can put it on our YouTube, podcast, and social media channels afterwards? And in addition, we will create an interview article from the transcript, as well as using it to support the book review.
Yes, I'm absolutely fine with all of those things. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. So let's get right into it. So EarthOrg is a not-for-profit environmental organization based in Hong Kong. Our aim is to bring attention to what is happening to natural ecosystems worldwide. We advocate for sustainable economic policies, for the protection of the natural environment, and an extension of governance or oversight to cover the global commons. With Earth.org Talks, we are engaging with inspiring change makers and thought leaders to share their opinion and knowledge with our global audience, all to bring attention to what we humans are doing to our planet. So welcome to our audience. I would just like to welcome Dr. Mark Jaccard, a professor of sustainable energy at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Vancouver's Simon Fraser University. His most recent book is The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success, published in January 2020. So Mark, as for our first question, in your book, you talk about the effectiveness or lack thereof of changing individual behavior to combat climate change. What is the difference between changing individual lifestyles and, as you put it, changing our behavior to become climate-concerned citizens?
Thanks for that question. Because it is a big part of the book. It's really tough on an individual person who's concerned about the climate to know what to do. You can feel so powerless as an individual because you think, well, what are my emissions? Well, it must be when I'm driving in a gasoline car, and maybe it's to do with my building. But then you hear all of these things on the media that it's the plastics, it's embedded in anything you're consuming. And so I've seen so much in the literature where people have gotten all of this messaging come at them, and then when I talk to people, and I talked to a lot of people in the last 30 years about this, I'm shocked by how many of them will feel powerless, paralyzed. I'm supposed to change absolutely everything, my job, where I live, how I get to work. And if we look at other environmental issues, and if we look at what experts are looking at with this environmental issue, it's essential that we make a technological change, that we stop burning coal, oil, and gas. And when you do that, it turns out that a lot of our behaviors won't change that much. But how do you get to where we stop burning coal, oil, and natural gas? Well, it's like with other environmental problems in the past, acid rain, urban air pollution, we need government policy. And so how do I, as a citizen, or how have we done it in the past, gotten good policy? And the way you do it is where politicians realize that it's in their interests to act on this issue. And that's also difficult, your one vote. So how do you expand the power of your vote? How do you become more engaged as a citizen? And so the book has a lot of aspects related to that. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is just say to people, yes, continue to be a really responsible consumer and person, living on this planet. Don't stop focusing on that. But that's not enough. And thank goodness it's not enough, because actually you can be effective as a citizen. And we look at where governments have done good things around the planet, and there's been some good successes with greenhouse gas reduction, whether in electricity or transportation or buildings, Swedish buildings, Norwegian cars, Chinese cars now, electricity in different parts of the world. It's been when citizens have gotten politicians to feel the pressure and to feel they have to act. So that's what I'm getting at with that kind of behavioral change.
Okay, and then just carrying on with the idea of individual change, why do you think people are so receptive to the misleading message that individual behavioral changes can have a substantial effect on mitigating climate change?
Right, and I think it's because, sort of following what I was just saying, people do want to help.
Yeah.
And and the irony is they can feel helpless on the behavioral side, but they also feel helpless on the political side. Like they'll see, gee, my fellow citizens didn't quite elect the politicians that I would have elected. And I'm not sure how sincere that group of politicians are. Now, when those politicians are in power, as I say, and I talk about it in the book, one of the things that citizen activism involves, of course, it's letter writing and being engaged politically, but it's also activism. And that activism can have a real range depending on, it's contingent on how sincere it looks like your politicians are. So I spent a lot of the book helping people try to identify what's sincere. Politicians can set targets all the time, but it's are they really implementing carbon pricing or regulations? So, why are people receptive to the other message? I think a lot of people feel helpless in the political process. And so at least behaviorally, I can make a decision about what I consume. And I hear it all the time in the media. And environmentalists are also into how can we live differently. And I've lived my whole life that way. I'm someone who's never had a parking pass at my university. I've cycled or taken the bus. And so I've tried to live that life, but I've also know, you really need to change the technologies and you need policy for that. So I think it's that mixture of people trying to do whatever they can. And when they're told behavioral is important, and it is, then they focus on that. And I guess I'm just trying to nudge them a little bit to also be engaged politically. So I'm not trying to get them to give up on the behavioral side, personal behavioral side.
Sure. So next question. Do you think that climate change has broadly begun to transcend political and ideological boundaries and become a more universally recognized existential threat by the public?
So the public is a tricky word. And I would say, what are we, 7.5 billion people on this planet? So if we want to call that the public, I would say about 6 billion or 6.5 billion people on this planet have not recognized climate as an important issue at all. Most of humanity has not. And there's good reasons for that. I mean, if you and I living in fairly wealthy countries, have a tendency to forget about who the public is. And so most of humanity really is worried about, getting enough food, getting shelter, getting a decent job so they can help their families. And in that case, you want electricity to be as cheap as possible. And so if your utility in Vietnam or Pakistan can get a hold of some coal that's really cheap, or natural gas if they're lucky, and that's how they'll get electricity. And you want to move goods and people, then you're going to use trucks that burn oil, that burn gasoline and diesel. And so that's the reality on the planet right now. Now, in the wealthier countries, I would agree that it goes up and down. All you need is a war, an economic recession, some other major crisis, and this will be low in the public's interest. They'll be worried about immediate economic issues. And so I'm always telling people, I remember when the public concern was bipartisan, in the United States in the 1990s. I remember again in the mid-2000s when Republicans, Mitt Romney as the governor and Arnold Schwarzenegger as the governor, were putting in climate policies, good policies. John McCain, eventual presidential candidate. So I'm trying to give some caution, but I don't want to be pessimistic. I do think the awareness is greater. I think that means that you're going to have more countries, and we are having more countries acting unilaterally, like saying, we're going to take the risk and show leadership. But I'm also saying, wait a minute, we're not on the right, and I write a chapter on this in the book. We need to understand the global nature of this problem, the global nature of this solution. And instead, we've got, some leading countries that are acting and their citizenry pushing them to act without thinking much about, how do we get the rest of the planet to act? Will our example be enough? And I don't think it is. I think if we look at the history of diplomacy, we're actually going to have to take more difficult decisions to get the public to act. And that's why, sorry for this convoluted answer to your word, the
No.
public, but it triggers me. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so talking about, what you think, how you think governments will act, what are your views then on the realistic outcomes of COP26?
So I'm among people working in this field for at least 3 decades who, but I remember when the Kyoto Agreement was signed, and a colleague of mine, David Victor, wrote a book on why it would fail. And and there are, so I'm among people who have been saying, and this is similar to my last answer to you, there has to be, this is a global, we call it a global collective action problem. And yet individual countries are still not really looking at this like a global collective action problem. They're looking at it as a domestic issue. What could we do? And the reason they do that is because it's really hard to act globally. So if you're a government of a country, you'll sometimes use the excuse of global, like why should we do anything if the Chinese are building another coal plant? So if you don't want to act, but otherwise you say we've got to act and we'll be an example, and then others will act. But it's like an example won't do it. It's and that's sort of been the language among the Europeans for a long time. So what I look for is that international processes like COP, because it doesn't just need to be COP, it can be like a summit of the United States and China or whatever, but that they're starting to talk seriously about compliance mechanisms, compulsory compliance mechanisms. And what I mean by that is, how do we make sure if some countries are acting, that there aren't other countries that are free riding or laggard on what we're doing? Because we won't solve this problem if we don't have a mechanism for that. And what could that mechanism be? Well, it's, you try to have carrots. We want to transfer money to developing countries, but it won't be enough for them to forego all of the burning of fossil fuels. So it's also going to have to be sticks. And people are afraid to talk about that, but that's the real world of global diplomacy. That's what the experts tell me. It's going to have to be boycotts, sanctions, tariffs, carbon tariffs. We're having some discussions about that now. The Europeans are talking about that. In my own country of Canada, the government's talking about that. They're still not talking strongly enough about that, in my view. And I do remember times in the past when people talked about that. Even prior to Kyoto, the US Senate said to Al Gore, the vice president under Bill Clinton, when he went to the Kyoto in 1996, 97 to negotiate, they said, don't come back if you don't have compliance mechanisms for the whole planet. And of course he didn't. And then the Americans refused to ratify the Kyoto Agreement. So for COP26, I have this mixture then of some optimism, because we seem to be moving a little further towards recognition of this, but it's still not nearly fast enough, in my view.
Sure. Okay, so in your book, you mentioned the various delusions that the fossil fuel industry and its allies package and sell to the public. There's that word again. But what is your opinion on low carbon technologies that may benefit fossil fuel interests, such as nuclear energy or carbon capture?
Yeah, so maybe certainly earlier in my career, I was one of those people who was just pro renewables, renewable energy, energy efficiency. And so I have a chapter on each of those, renewable energy and efficiency, because I also used to believe that they were cheaper than fossil fuels, and and never thought about fossil fuel prices going down. And then the evidence convinced me at least 20 years ago that fossil fuels are an amazing form of energy. There are people on this planet who come from regions or countries that are very well endowed in fossil fuel. And so we basically have to say to these people, to solve this climate issue, we need to annihilate your economy. Like, we need you to just leave that stuff in the ground. And my book is about how humans are biased. And so, not surprisingly, when you tell that to Saudi Arabia or Russia or a part of Canada where I come from, which would be this area in the center of Canada called Alberta and Saskatchewan, where the oil sands are, and that's well known. But the United States has regions like that. A lot of Australia, lots of countries do. And when you try to tell them, we're going to annihilate your part of the economy, then all they do is they help support the fossil fuel industry in misinformation campaigns and so on. And so I am now, and we have delayed so long, we have not been good strategically when it came to a global effort, as I mentioned in the previous question. And when it came to how do we bring people together? Well, to me, the way you do it is like we're now at the state where it's all of the above. So if some region if some country has some nuclear plants and they're managing them properly and they're starting to develop how to treat the radioactive waste, I'm not going to be opposed to nuclear power. I don't think we should have a lot of nuclear power on this planet, but I'm not going to be like a purist. Okay, we're going to solve this problem. There's no nuclear power. We're going to solve this problem, and we're never going to touch fossil fuels anymore. That we even if someone comes along and says we have a lot of fossil fuels, we're going to use them. We're going to do carbon capture and storage. So we're going to convert them into electricity or hydrogen. So clean form of energy at the end use. And we're going to make sure at the production level there's no emissions. Why would I rule that out? Like, it is really too late for, like, we're in the old saying that my mother used to have, beggars can't be choosers.
Yeah.
Like, this is not the time to be a purist. You're part of the problem if you're a purist. You need to look in my view, you need to look in the mirror if you're being a purist right now.
And does that include, the more extreme and potentially dangerous proposals like geoengineering?
This is where I'm afraid to answer because I was so opposed to geoengineering 20 years ago. And I'm kind of surprised that people that are opposed to it now, of course, you don't do this like just let's go shoot some sulfur into the atmosphere, but we should be studying this really carefully. And the reason is because we failed globally. And one of the reasons we failed is because a lot of people who are opposed to geoengineering are also opposed to carbon tariffs. Because they say, well, it'll hurt the developing world. Well, actually, we should be saving the planet from climate change because the biggest impacts will be in the developing world. And that may mean, though, the use of tariffs and hopefully transfers of wealth. But actually, voters in rich countries are too selfish for that. I'm not going to wait for everybody to be unselfish to save the planet. But what's happened is because of that, we're in a world now where we have to consider geoengineering. And so I will not say no to geoengineering. I say we have to study it. We have to get ready to even do experiments with it. And doing that at the same time that we're putting on carbon tariffs around the world in serious international negotiations, that individual countries are moving rapidly to decarbonize. So it's not either or. Like some people say, oh, we'll do geoengineering and then we'll keep burning fossil fuels. We're not in that world anymore. We got to do everything.
Sure. So you say that the most important sectors to decarbonize are electricity and transportation. So in light of the green recovery packages that have emerged worldwide over the past year due to COVID, as well as the high degree of investments governments have promised towards decarbonizing these areas, are you more optimistic about the future than you were when you wrote the book?
Right. So just qualify slightly what you said. When you say electricity and transportation are most important, or that I said that, what I was saying is that they were the best strategically available to us. So it's important to lower emissions in steel production, in airlines, everything like that. But if you're an individual country and there isn't a global agreement yet, the electricity sector is domestic mostly. And so if you and we know technologies to do that now, wind and solar and so on, and carbon capture and storage. And so, so you can act as a country on your electricity sector and decarbonize it without having a huge effect on your trade, on, as opposed to what we call the emission intensive trade exposed industries. And the same thing with your transportation sector, and I would even say your building sector. So the reason I focused on those sectors was to help citizens and climate sincere politicians in willing countries to figure out what can we move quickly on. while we're trying to get an international agreement so that, and penalties so that the heavy industry can also decarbonize.
Mm,
Now, your question had some several elements to it that
yeah.
then you said, okay, electricity and transportation. Now, what about with COVID and governments are willing to spend more money? On that one, probably like everyone, I've been very involved in my own country in advising people on this, whether at the national government level, but we also have subnational governments in Canada. We're a federal country, like the United States or Australia or Germany.
Mhm.
And so the provincial governments in Canada are also important. So they spend money on the COVID recovery, just as does our federal government. And I think a role that I've tried to play is to kind of warn my environmentalist friends who get so excited about the green recovery, like we're going to spend this money
Mhm.
and then we'll have a greener, we'll be getting this greenhouse gas reductions. So an economist like me has to point out 95 to 98% of the expenditures that are needed to decarbonize electricity or buildings or transportation are going to be private funds of households and firms. And so government spending doesn't do it. And if you allow governments to think, oh, good, we were going to increase the carbon price like a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, we were going to increase the stringency of the regulations, we'll delay all that and we'll spend some money on COVID instead, then there's a huge cost to that. And so I'm someone who keeps sort of ranting, and I'm not the only one. There are people in other countries, colleagues that I know in from the US to Australia to Europe, who will be saying, oh, no, 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 no. Sure, spend some money, but a lot of the money to come out of COVID is not really money spent on decarbonizing and putting more electricity, vehicle recharging for electric vehicles and so on. Sure, but the private sector is doing that as well. Get the policy signals right.
Mm.
And so a big part of my book, or a significant message from my book, is as a citizen, I have this flow chart. Are they putting in pricing and regulation? Are they increasing in stringency, over time? And that is huge compared to COVID money they would spend. And so that's why in the final part of my answer to your question, you asked, so does this change anything I would write in the book today after COVID? And it wouldn't. And the reason is because I actually put this book together over about an 8-year period. I used it with a lot of grad students in a course that I've been teaching, a seminar, and and we've seen recessions come and go, we've seen wars come and go, and now we've seen a pandemic come and go. And we know that when those things happen, people talk about, oh, this will be this opportunity to reduce emissions, and that's a distraction generally. There's things you can do with COVID recovery or recession recovery in 2011, but you really need to have the policies in place that affect private decisions. What kind of car do I buy? How do I heat my house? And so on, and an electricity firm, how do I make electricity? A steel firm, how do I make steel? Those are the big decisions. They're private decisions, private investment.
Okay, so thank you. Great. Moving away from private investment. So, with the US now taking a more decisive role in global climate leadership, how do you think that Biden can or will leverage his influence and pressure more ambitious climate policies from other countries?
So, this is the big hope,
Yeah.
and it's a tricky one. So I'm someone who's always hopeful. And so I don't want to be a wet blanket, and say, oh no, and at the same time, I want to help people be realistic. So President Biden is unlikely to be able to put in major legislation like a cap and trade for the US that would affect all of its emissions. And, but he can try to follow Obama's lead in regulating the electricity sector for its pollution, so under the Environmental Protection Agency. And he can work more dramatically with vehicle emission and efficiency regulations that actually can accelerate the movement of fuel switching towards electric and hydrogen vehicles, and perhaps even to biofuel, biodiesel, for example, in trucking. But what I'm, and he can go and talk and meet bilaterally with different countries. And I think the Chinese, you know, we talk about how the Chinese built all those coal plants, but the Chinese are sort of leading the world in electric cars. And that has a huge impact for the developing world. And, you know, and all their work in solar, photovoltaics and wind turbines and helping to lower the costs of all of those. So I think there are opportunities for a Biden administration to link together with the Chinese and the Europeans and set an example, and hopefully bring India along.
Mhm.
What I really hope is that, and apropos my earlier comments, is that a Biden administration might say, and we need to start using tariffs. We need to start encouraging climate leading countries to apply tariffs to countries that are not moving on climate. That doesn't mean that you put tariffs on, you know, products from Bangladesh or like in a punitive way, but it's you signal to all countries the tariff rate is going to go up over time. You need to act over the next decade or two. Here's where we're headed. And so I'm really hoping for that kind of initiative from the Biden government. So that would be consistent with the other answers I gave you. If we're not getting that, I do fear that the 6 billion people on this planet will continue to put in equipment, infrastructure, steel plants, electricity plants, trucking sectors that are really using fossil fuels and increasing emissions.
Okay. So do you think, you know, kind of touching on China, so do you think that democratic countries, you know, afflicted by election cycles can achieve the same long-term environmental policy outcomes as non-democratic states such as China?
Right. That's an interesting question. And I'm not a political scientist, but I've read a lot on this because I'm very interested in it. And I'm interested in how it plays into the things I know, which are technologies and equipment, and then the economics of all of that. So let's say the decisions by firms and households. And when I look around the world at where transition has occurred, I notice like dramatic transition, that is a movement away from burning fossil fuels for something. It's often happened in sort of like an 8-year or 1 decade time period. And the reason is because in our so just think, we say, oh, we're going to decarbonize. Here's our target in 2050. That's 30 years away. And as your question suggests, we're not going to elect the same government for 30 years. We have to be realistic about that. So this is why I'm also interested in things like electricity. I've seen the French, when they built nuclear plants in the 1980s and 90s, in basically a 15-year period, so a little more than a decade, they got rid of all these coal plants and oil burning industry. I've seen it where in my own country, in the province of Ontario, that's the biggest province in the middle of Canada where Toronto is, how a quarter of their electricity was from coal plants. And in the period 2004 to 2014, it was 1 decade, 2 election cycles, a government came in and said, we're going to close the coal plants. And they did it. And in fact, even if they'd lost the election 4 years after they started this, they'd already done so much that a new government coming in wouldn't have been able to change that.
Okay.
I've seen in Sweden where they got serious about the building sector in the 1980s. And within a decade or so, they got most of the buildings in Sweden, so their district heat systems and individual buildings, away from burning fossil fuels. And now we're seeing in Norway where a government is moving in a very short time period to move towards electric vehicles. And I also remember back in the 80s and 90s, so these are examples I have in my book, where Brazil quickly moved to ethanol in sugarcane-based ethanol in transportation. And I calculate the CO2 emission effect of that. Why am I pointing out these examples? I'm pointing them out because they're examples when people said, we'll take, a government said, here's a sector in our economy we think we have the alternative energy source, and we think we can transition that sector in sort of a 2 electoral cycle, and we can get enough done in the first 4 years that if we can just win that next election, it's mission accomplished in that area. So I know that doesn't fit the economist model. The economist model is you do the whole economy at the same time, and wherever it's cheapest is how you should do this. That's more economically efficient. But to me, that's being ignorant about politics and just what your question hinted at, which is what can you do quickly to transform an area so it's irreversible? Because no one's going to bring it back the other way. And this is why even Obama's efforts with electricity generation in the United States kind of made it hard for a Donald Trump to come along and say, oh, now I'm in power for 4 years, I'm going to restart all those coal plants, which he was unable to do. Like the momentum kept going.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, thank you for that. So do you think that there is more willingness now than there was a year ago for countries to come up with a more enforceable and accountable system for reducing emissions than the current non-binding one put in place after Paris? One that could include more stringent regulations, carbon pricing, and border tariffs.
Yeah. Well, as I sort of summarizing the various answers I've given you, I'm always hopeful.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful that the people around Biden and and there is one thing that's happened in Europe, which I think is interesting. The Europeans, it seemed to me for a couple of decades, and I'd give talks in Europe and I'd sort of chastise them. I'd say, Europe was doing more than anywhere else in the world, so it's really not fair to chastise them. But I would be saying, you guys, you keep talking about how you're going to be a model for the world, and you're even going to use something called the Clean Development Mechanism and send money to other countries and your own aid, and that's all important. But you really should be combining this with carbon tariffs, because otherwise you're being naive about self-interest and governments and the planet and how many people could still benefit from using fossil fuels in the developing world. And so we can't go down that path. And so what makes me optimistic is the Europeans now are moving so aggressively with their own emissions that they've started, their industry is telling them, oh, no, you need to be forcing change throughout the planet. So my hopeful scenario of over the next 12 to 24 months is a scenario in which the combination of a US president, China, who's very willing to act and has done a lot, and a Europe that is pushing so hard that it realizes it needs the rest of the world to come along now, or its industries will suffer greatly and so on, that might lead to a greater movement towards the kind of compulsory policies and compulsory trade instruments that, and even if they don't get implemented, it's serious talk about that, can shift the dynamic of decision making in Indonesia, electricity sector, or in trucking and so on. And that's kind of that's my optimistic scenario.
Okay, so is there anything that you would add to the book in the time since you wrote it?
Nope. I would say, as I answered to your previous question, has COVID changed anything? And no, as I say, I could have come out with this book probably 5 years ago. It hadn't changed a lot in the 5 year and even 8 years ago, because it's a book that's trying to help people deal with our tendency to have these preferences and wishful thinking biases. And so the same issues are still there. People are saying, I still hear people saying, electric cars are now cheaper than gasoline cars, or they're getting cheaper. They're almost at price parity. And I always say to people, oh, and where do you think the oil price is going to go? Because the oil price is going to fall. So how can you make that calculation without having a vision of where's the price of oil going to fall? The international price of oil could fall to $10 a barrel 10 years from now. So gasoline will be really cheap if you don't have a carbon tax or some price policy on it. Same thing with natural gas. People will say, oh, it's now cheaper to generate electricity with renewables than with fossil fuels. And that's just not true. Like, the renewables you're doing with wind and solar is an unreliable kind of electricity. So it's not the same product as coming from a natural gas or coal plant. So then with the wind and solar, I have to combine storage of some kind. And I even, well, in some areas have to have long-term storage. And so natural gas and the price of natural gas and coal will keep falling.
Mm.
So my point is, I'm just giving you that one example of something that was true 10 years ago, and it's true now, and I'm afraid it'll be true 5 years from now. And so my book is just this hearkening to ask, um, as one person wrote about my book, which I really like, they said it was just to try to help nudge people, well-meaning people, towards a little bit sharper thinking. And that message of the book is still there in all the areas we've talked about: global diplomacy, domestic policy and electricity or transportation. So that's the message of the book, is still valid in my view, and very urgent in my view.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So our last question for tonight is, why did you decide to release the book online for free?
Oh yeah. um, you never know if you're making the right decision.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't want to present myself as having a great wisdom about that, but my publisher and I talked about it. And as I say, I mean, I'm lucky enough that I'm a well-paid university professor. Taxpayers in my country support me. I've developed computer models that would have had a lot of commercial value in terms of the energy economy system over the years, and I've always made them free to everyone, because I feel my job is as a public servant. And then when it came to this book, the idea was, unlike some academic books that I've written in the past, this is a book for people who are, who can read, you don't need any kind of school education, and who are concerned, as I call them, climate concerned citizens.
Yes.
And it's to try to help them be more effective as citizens. And so and also thinking about the current generation, which may not want to tote around a book as much. So if you can make something free online that they can load down to a device, and then maybe high school teachers or university professors will be more willing to order the book. And I've had a lot of feedback that's been quite confirming of that. Now, the book hasn't done as well as it might have, but of course it came out, and I had a big book tour already, like tickets purchased throughout the United States and Canada. And so the book got COVID interrupted, as you would say. But it's done very well, and it's rebounding again. And it's rebounding in part because of that free access. And I've really had a good feedback of that, of sort of undergraduates in university saying that they've read it and passed it on to friends. And so it being a free and electronic book like that, that was the reason, and that has been some of the success of the book, and I'm hoping that it'll be more of it. And I appreciate this interview, which also helps to publicize it. So I really appreciate this.
Great, of course. And I mean, and what a wonderful way to end this interview. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge and your insights with us.